Hi again, I hope this lecture finds you well again, and welcome to the final session of lectures. I hope they've been going okay, and I hope you've enjoyed the readings that I've given you. These two sessions for this week I have based on the readings that I've given you. So again, have a look at those and you'll get a bit more of an idea of, you get a bit more information that goes in depth into what I'm talking about today. So to begin with. So what we were looking at in the last session, you might remember now, was we talked about what it meant to be professional, being a professional youth worker. We discussed some of the ideas from CIRCOM about that, what professional youth work looked like, being a professional youth worker, and why has this become even more important, an even more important topic for youth workers in the past couple of years. Okay, so as we know, there's professional youth workers and there's voluntary youth workers, and very much so in a British and an Irish context as opposed to a Greek context, where I know it's predominantly voluntary youth work that happens in Greece, but in Britain and Ireland, obviously, as we all know, we have professional youth workers. So what makes the professional youth worker different from the voluntary youth worker? And what has changed, as we all know, over the past nearly 10 years now, has been the economic climate that we've all been living in, particularly in Europe. So the aim of this session is to look at, okay, so why did we look at the importance of communicating what we do, how, and being professional, which was the last couple of lectures. Okay, so why is that really important now when we're living in an economic climate that we have been, particularly since 09, 10, 11, 12. It's now important due to the world economic downturn. Where has the money gone that was being put into youth work, particularly in the early noughties, particularly in an Irish context, and that we're being asked more so now, and I've hinted to it a little bit in the past few lectures, in regard to we're being asked to prove why youth work, how youth work is so worthwhile, okay? And this is being asked through outcomes, through targets, as we're all aware of, okay? So we need to be able to prove. It's not enough to say that it's for the good of young people. We need to be able to show, it needs to be tangible, why youth work should have investment in. Okay, so these are some of the there's some of the asks that are coming to youth work. But when they're asking us, how is it worthwhile? And this is what I talked about in the last session about communicating. So when we're asked about why is youth work worthwhile, do we communicate? Do you get the essence of youth work through the numbers, through the activities? No, you don't. It happens through the process of the activities, like we said. But how do we explain that? We explain that through conversation. We explain that predominantly through stories, but that more often than not is not captured through the funding forms, the funding applications that we need to fill out, okay? So this is what we're going to look at, okay? So in an Irish context, just to give a little bit of context about where Ireland has come over the past number of years in regard to after that downturn that happened in 2008. So what happened to Ireland after that? So we had our own crisis then within Ireland because of that downturn. So as most of us know, the banks had massive debts. Developers and banks had massive debts, which, to put it very simply, without going too in depth into the economic situation in Ireland, private debt was turned into public debt at the end of 2008 with that deal that was signed, between the Irish government and the Troika. So this came to a total of 67.5 billion euro of a bailout programme, which was given from the Troika to Ireland at the time. So the Troika, just to emphasise, was made up of the EU, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank. From 2008 into 2009, Ireland then introduced a programme of austerity, where massive cuts were made to a number of public services, wage freezes, things, and a number of areas in Irish society were cut, and money was taken back or chopped So obviously we went through a massive program of austerity. So what did this mean for youth work in particular? So since 2008, expenditure on youth work has dropped by a total of 30%, okay? However, the EU report, Working with Young People, the Value of Youth Work in the European Union, states Ireland experienced cuts through its youth work policy development, okay? Though its youth work policy development continued. So basically what it was saying that even though Ireland did experience cuts, as other European countries did as well at the time, we actually continued to look at our youth work policy, and try to develop that, try to continue developing that. So even though there was cuts happening, we still tried to look at ensuring that Ireland youth work was provided for, and we did. But I suppose you would question it or critique it possibly from the perspective of, it's one thing to try and progress policy, and that is positive, but it's another thing to actually try and enact it and have the resources. And if we don't have the resources to enact policy from any perspective, it's one thing having the policy, but it's going to be a lot more difficult to try and enact that if we don't have the resources. So the youth services cut was extensive. So 33% of total cuts. So in government, amongst all the departments, 33% of the total cuts that were taken from the youth service, despite the fact that the youth services budget only get 14% anyway of the total department budget, okay? So that was a massive cut at the time, okay, which you'll read in Malloch's article, which I've handed you. So youth work got quite severely severed during 2010, 2011 and 2012 with these cuts that were happening. So youth workers' own experiences, apologies, I just seen I've spelled experiences wrong again. But youth workers' own experiences, which are accounted for in Malloch's piece of research, shows that they had the budget cuts had a significant impact on frontline services. So the youth workers and the services that were available to young people, jobs were lost. There was high unemployment amongst young people. So you had a lot of young people out of work, out of training. So therefore, what happens when there's so many young people hanging around not getting work? They obviously need more support, more so than ever when these are some of the consequences. There's more demand for youth work services to do more for less. So again, this look towards youth work to try and do something for these young people who aren't working, who maybe aren't in training, who are hanging around, are looking for something to do. So there's more pressure on a youth work service, obviously, to do more for these young people, and as we know, address this whole employment issue, which has really come to the fore over the past couple of years, not only in an Irish context, but in a European context. So, as we know, your youth unemployment scheme through Europe and the various things that have happened in regard to addressing youth unemployment in Europe. But the issue was that there was no resources being put into the youth services. In fact, obviously, as we just saw, they were actually being cut. So you're asking youth workers and you're asking youth services, the government, were to address the growing problem of youth unemployment, yet funding wasn't being put into it, okay, to a large extent. So there was pressure on the services. This then impacted on staff well-being and morale, okay, as to how much they could do. Enough was never enough. How much can you put into yourself and be asked for when you're continuously getting cuts, when you don't have the resources to run programs, and when you yourself, when the inflation and the price of living is rising and your wages are still staying the same that they were 5 years previous to that, okay, so it's that took its toll on youth workers, as some of you might know who've been youth workers for the past number of years, like myself. So there was concerns for the survival of youth work going forward, okay. So on a positive note, youth workers say that because of these cuts and because of not having maybe €2,000 or €3,000 to run a 10-week or a 12-week program, okay, they had to look to being creative and innovative, okay? And they, in Malak's article, they talk about running a bike project, okay? And that was the same. I remember myself trying to run things during 2010, 11, 12, trying to run programs, and you pretty much drew from your own resources, your own, as I said in the last lecture, your own toolbox, okay? What could you draw from yourself? What could volunteers bring to the table? Maybe there was volunteers that had particular skills, like maybe something like fixing bikes, or there could be art skills, or there could be cooking skills that volunteers might have. So what could you, instead of just drawing from the pool of money, instead of just drawing from the pool of money that might have always been there, that wasn't there now, you were drawn more and more so from your own set of skills, from your co-workers' sets of skills, and from volunteers' skills to run programs, okay? So it was bound to be, so youth workers did say that it forced them to be more creative and more innovative, and not continue to just rely on money that had been there, okay? So moving on to Britain, and an example of how the economic downturn affected Britain, okay, was in that second article that I have given you, Business as Usual, which is set in Newcastle, and in November 2012. So they had thriving youth services going on and youth projects going on throughout the noughties, 2007, 2008, 2009, and in November 2012, a £90 million budget cut was announced for the next 3 years, okay? So a bit similar again to what had happened in Ireland at the time, okay? So they were going to cut, and in January 2013, another £10 million cut was announced, okay? Not only to youth work services, but to public services, okay? So Newcastle City Council closed things like swimming pools, libraries, cultural centres, and the whole art budget, 100% of the arts budget was cut, okay? So even before this, youth provision and youth workers were consistently being axed, and this was the final nail in the coffin, okay? So again, you'll read a little bit more in depth in the article about this, but just to show parallel as to what was happening in Britain as well around a similar time, okay, during this economic downturn. There had been an example of what was called within youth work in Newcastle, called the My Place project. So this was a plan for a building-based city centre project which young people were heavily involved with in 2009, and this for 2 years, and it was abolished in 2011. So young people bought into this project, they gave their ideas, they were running it, they were steering it, and then bam, the money was the whole idea of the project was abolished. So you can imagine then what that done to the morale of the young people in the city, the morale of the youth workers. Youth workers then working with the young people were put on a 0-hour contract, and were given no time to work with the young people, okay? So again, conditions at an all-time low for youth workers, and there was no incentive, no reason, and no possibility, because obviously if you're a professional youth worker, you still need to be able to earn a living. So there was no incentive for youth workers to work with the young people from a monetary point of view and from a professional sense. The young people and the youth workers had been meeting in the Connections office in Newcastle for 5 years, and then this was closed down as well. So commissioning, early intervention. So what happened and what begun then was early intervention, grant delivered positive activities for young people was put out for tender. So this process of commissioning was put out. So where youth projects, local areas weren't being funded anymore to run the projects, what they did was whoever could come back, often it was a national organisation, with the best price to run a project in Newcastle was what was happening. So neighbourhood projects that were being run locally got together to try and achieve the tender and compete for the tender, but they didn't get it. It was a national organisation that won the contract, which means that a significant amount of money is then used for management to run these projects. So I will look at this a little bit further in the next session. Okay, Thanks.